All right, we've got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump in. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you've joined us today. This is the first of a webinar series on green leasing. Today, we're going to talk about Green Leasing 101, talk about the basics. We are so excited to have our three organizations come together for this webinar series. We're all passionate about this topic and green leasing and the role of the lease and decarbonization of real estate. We all have similar but also distinct perspectives and information that we want to share with you. So before we really dive in, I'm going to do some quick introductions. So I'm Marla Thalheimer. I'm the Senior Director of Business Engagement for the Institute for Market Transformation, or IMT. IMT is a nonprofit based out of DC, and our mission is to drive demand for high performance buildings. With that, I'll turn it over to Paulina for a quick introduction.
Thanks, Marla. I'll first start as an intro to JLL, Jones Lang LaSalle. We are a global leader in commercial real estate services. We provide services across investment advisory, brokerage, project development, property management, operation, and so on. So we really are touching sort of every point of the real estate life cycle across asset classes as well. The way our sustainability services are organized is that they sort of follow our overall business model in that we not only help our clients plan out their ESG strategies and goals, but we also help them execute and manage these goals along the way. At JLL, I am our sustainability and ESG research lead for the Americas. I'm based in California and have been at JLL for about 6 years. I've worked on some of our flagship reports like Green Leasing 2.0, which we'll discuss, of course, today. I'm happy to be here with you all and look forward to talking about the world of green leases.
All right, Kara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kara Kokernak, and I am a Senior Director at the Urban Land Institute. The Urban Land Institute is an industry organization with over 48,000 members worldwide. I work on our Center for Sustainability team, and more specifically in our decarbonization program, where I head up all of our thought leadership and content creation. We also run a Greenprint Community of Practice, which is a member organization a little bit smaller than our wider ULI organization, where we really have leaders and innovators in the decarbonization space in real estate. So there's about 125 real estate owners that are committed to improving the performance of buildings and achieving net zero by 2050. One of the ways to do that is through green leasing. So I'm really excited to be participating on today's webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Kara. All right, so our roadmap for today, we're going to talk about why green leasing even matters. And then we're going to give you some examples, green leasing in the real world. We're going to talk about where you start. How do you even begin this whole journey? And then we're going to have some Q&A. So feel free to put any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring both. For the most part, we'll address them at the Q&A part, but we may take one or two throughout. And then we also just will review our key takeaways and resources. We also have a special guest that's going to pop in. So we're excited to have another person joining us here in just a few minutes when we get to our real world examples. All right, so let's talk about why green leasing matters. Green leasing is not new, but there's a lot of reasons why it continues to gain more and more traction than ever in the market for tenants, landlords, and across all sectors. So there are several market drivers at play that are really shifting the way companies are doing business and how they make business decisions. We're seeing increased climate-related disasters happening on a regular basis. And there's just ripple effects. This is causing insurance rates to skyrocket, making energy costs unpredictable. And more importantly, many companies are seeing increased demand from their customers. They want to do business with responsible companies. There's also an increasing number of investors that want to see companies more environmental disclosures. And there's a growing list of ESG and climate disclosure requirements. We all know about the pending SEC climate disclosures, but also what's happening in Europe, right? That has a big effect on on the US companies if they have European investors. And there's also this ever-going trend across the US for building performance standards. So just want to show this IMT map. Many of you have probably seen this before, but this is the state of BPS, or Building Performance Standards. If you're not familiar with this map, if you've never seen this before, you're going to want to go to the imt.org/policy. And we have all kinds of policy information. You're going to want to keep up with this information. This is so important because this map shows where policy has been enacted. Everybody knows about Local Law 97, Berto in Boston, Denver's got a lot going on. So there's a lot that's already been enacted, but there's a lot coming down the pike. And that's where the National BPS Coalition comes in. These are all the jurisdictions that have made a commitment to enact policy around building performance by Earth Day 2024. And even as close as we are to Earth Day 2024, we're seeing more and more being added to this list every day. I think at last count, this covers more than 25% of the US buildings. I mean, that's not nothing, right? So there's a lot of coverage here. So there's a lot of buildings that are going to need to be working on performance standards. So I want to turn over to Paulina, because Paulina, you have some super interesting data really around a lot of these market drivers that I just mentioned. So what are you seeing at JLL?
Thanks, Marla. So regulation is no doubt a big driver for sustainability in the built environment. And it's of course more apparent in the markets you mentioned, right? New York with Local Law 97 and Boston as well. But what we're seeing with our client base at a high level in the US, at least for now, is that market forces are really where the push is coming from. On the investor side, liquidity, pricing, and debt are increasingly being influenced by a building's environmental performance. The risk of inaction on decarbonization especially will lead to a financial risk sooner than many realize. And this brings concerns around attracting high quality tenants, value preservation, regulatory risk, reputational risk, and so on. And these are all increasingly top of mind for investors. So given this narrowing focus on the environmental impact of real estate among investors, frameworks like GRESB, which is a global real estate sustainability benchmark, and it's what you're seeing here on this graph. These frameworks are evolving to help evaluate and improve the sustainability performance of buildings. Today, more than 95% of investors use ESG data in their processes, in their decision-making processes. So participation in GRESB in particular has increased by 40% in just 3 years. It now includes over 2,000 real estate entities. But still there are various headwinds at play today, especially in the office sector. So investors are increasingly looking for value-add initiatives. We know that the green premium exists. There's many studies that have proven that. In our own research, we found that across North American cities, green certified stock commands a rental premium of about 7.1%. But as tenants increasingly look to materialize on their climate targets specifically, they'll more and more look for environmental performance indicators on top of these green credentials. This indicates a potential increase in the green premium for low carbon spaces. And this is a trend that we're already seeing in European markets like London and Paris, where low carbon prime office spaces are beating historical rental highs despite reduced market activity. So to be able to meet this demand, existing stock must be addressed. In 2022, we estimated that net zero carbon retrofitting rates in mature property markets would need to increase from around 1% a year to 3% to meet our climate targets. And this would require $3 trillion in investment. So it's really not something that owners can take on their own, which brings us to our next slide, the occupier side. Shifting over to occupiers, what we've seen across our tenant base, across our client base, is that more and more occupiers are committing to climate targets compared to our investor and owner clients. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is what you're seeing on this graph, this is a leading framework used by corporates. It provides the process and methodology for emissions reductions and target setting. In just 2 years, corporate commitments to SBTI has increased fourfold. It now includes, or now over 6,000 companies have committed through SBTI. So with these commitments comes the added pressure of aligning their real estate strategies and operations to them, right? So we do expect demand for low carbon space in particular to grow rapidly. With that, supply pipelines today are not keeping pace. In another recent study, we found that for every 4 square feet of demand between now and 2030, there's only 1 square foot of supply in the current pipeline. This is across 8 major US markets. So as corporations look to turn their climate commitments into actions, they'll be more and more looking to assess their lease portfolio, make complex decisions around location strategies and operations so that they can meet their targets. On our next slide, we see that historically, if we jump to the, thank you, historically, what we're talking about here is that tenants and also owners and developers have sought out green certifications as the complete measure of sustainability in the built environment or for a building. But emissions and energy use is really only one component of these frameworks, at least across the most common certifications today. So on the graph on the right, you can see that there is no real correlation between certification score and emissions. So because of this, at least in their most popular form today, they're not necessarily a good indicator for performance. So occupiers need to look beyond credentials to ensure that they can meet their targets. On the other side, for investors, certifications are becoming standard across prime office markets. Green certified buildings make up over 50% of prime office stock in most markets, and that's the chart on the left. So they're no longer a differentiator for investors, and developers in more established markets will need to also take more steps to ensure that their property and their assets remain competitive. So across the board, sustainability focused owners and occupiers will need to look beyond certifications and seek these metrics that do sort of quantify a low carbon building. These are energy efficiency, electrification, clean energy sources, and so on. Action to advance in the built environment has also typically landed on owners. And if we go on the next slide, when it comes to what we're talking about here today, or at least in these slides, when we're talking about emissions and building performance, tenant activity accounts for a greater share of responsibility. In leased office spaces, tenant activity accounts for 55 to 75% of operational emissions. And it's worth noting that this typically reaches 90 to 100% for industrial spaces. So because of this, tenant-landlord collaboration is a must-have if our industry is to reach ESG goals. Improvement to a building that advances any of these goals will bring value to landlords and tenants, and that value should be shared in proportion to who makes it happen. And this is exactly where green leases can play a vital role. So with that, I'll turn it back to Marla to go over green lease fundamentals.
Wow. All right, that is incredible data, Paulina. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, obviously, building performance matters. And I mean, and maybe some of you in the audience have been in this situation. Maybe you have environmental goals and, you feel like your landlord isn't, willing to work with you. Or if you're a landlord, you feel like your tenants aren't working with you. So I see some clapping, so getting some affirmation there. So one of the best ways to try to help, make this work is by the green lease, right? And you don't have to call it a green lease. Sometimes people don't like the word green. You can call it a high performance lease, an energy aligned lease. But the idea here is to try to, at least on a few clauses here, because it's so important, these buildings aren't going to get to these levels that they need without tenants and landlords working together. So it's really about creating that collaborative agreement so that tenant and landlord can work together to create a win-win outcome, right? We want it to be an equitably aligned of the cost and the benefits. probably, we all know about the split incentive, right? Who benefits from the measure, who pays. And honestly, the split incentive was the catalyst for the green lease way back. I mean, a landlord should be able and willing to invest in an asset, but pass that cost through to the tenant, as long as the tenant, can agree and benefit. They're going to benefit from that measure. That's sort of where it all started. There's also several other key parameters for a green lease that are super important. We're going to outline the priorities of both parties, want to make sure you prioritize environmental health and wellness, establish a sustainability point of contact. We're going to talk a little bit more about this one. It's so basic, but it can be so important. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. And really just sort of describe and define how a building and the tenant space is going to operate. And then the big one, enable the ability to report progress of the data, right? It's who has it, who needs it. That's a big one. So if these things aren't sort of laid out in the lease, then it just becomes a struggle throughout that whole duration of that lease term. So Kara, would love to turn it over to you just to talk a little bit about this situation a bit more and sort of where the lease fits in from your perspective.
Thank you, Marla. And I just sort of wanted to reiterate too, a few of the things that Paulina said. I mean, those data points are fascinating, right? The 55 to 75% of a building's energy use is tagged with occupiers or tenants. That's such a huge amount. And then I believe, Paulina, you said almost 92% in industrial buildings. So that really speaks to, and I saw someone make a comment in the chat that the data speaks for itself. And that really speaks to the fact that tenant owner collaboration is key to decarbonization. So there are challenges, and I'm going to go over a few of those challenges before we jump into some of the more basics of how to put together a green lease or some green leases out in the wild, as I like to say. So whole building data is a challenge when you have owners and occupiers in the same building. So a triple net lease is an agreement on a property where the tenant or leasee promises to pay all the expenses of the property, including real estate taxes, building insurance, maintenance, energy efficiency upgrades, all of the above. But a lot of these structures have no transparency for owners and then for tenants as well. Additionally, data collection can be difficult because some municipalities require utilities to provide whole building energy, water data, and other times landlords can leverage submeters and green leases to hit that data collection, but it really can be tricky to get owners and tenants to come together on whole building data collection. It's also an iterative process. So if there's a large portfolio and an owner has buildings across the region or across the US and then has multiple tenants in all of those buildings, it really becomes a little tricky on who is responsible for collecting that data. So is it the property manager at the building site? Is it the tenant in the portion of the building that they're using? Or is it even higher? So the sustainability lead who is managing the process for all buildings and all tenant spaces. And most companies, unfortunately, I know Marla and Paulina, you two probably have experience with this, that most companies start by manually looking at utility bills. Which, does that sound painful? Because yes, it is painful. So most companies start by looking at utility bills for consumption or asking tenants for utility bills. Where there are those municipalities or utilities that require reporting on energy consumption, there are some improvements where utility offers, the green button or a direct line into Energy Star Portfolio Manager or other data collection system. But it's often an iterative process, and we haven't found the golden ticket for whole building data yet. So it's important to include that in your leasing. So we talked a little bit about whole building data, but why do companies need whole building data? We talked about this a little bit, and Marla really teed it up for us, is that we have these sustainability goals for your building or portfolio. Again, maybe that's regionally, maybe that's across the US, maybe that's globally. And Paulina already mentioned that tenants comprise of over 50% of energy use in a building. And that really speaks to that owners can achieve sustainability on their own. You can have lofty, high level ESG or sustainability goals as a building owner, but if you don't have your tenants along for the ride, you're just not going to get there. Sustainability improvements can also have some high upfront costs. When they benefit from lease spaces, tenants can reap the savings in a triple net lease. The period for improving base building systems is often longer than a lease length. So there's often an issue when, why would you make an improvement if your lease length isn't going to reap the benefits of payback? And then also cost share agreements are not as common as you would think, which is a green lease is another way to meet that challenge. And lastly, occupant buy-in is necessary. Tenants are smart. You can put improvements or occupancy sensors or other tech in your building thinking it will reduce energy, but tenants can certainly override improvements that they don't like, don't want to use, or don't know how to use. So it's really important to educate your tenants as well. And then getting tenants to support and embrace sustainability is critical. And having corporate tenants that have their own sustainabilities align with your sustainability. So you might have a building owner company that has specific goals, and then you have multiple tenant companies that have their specific goals. And in an ideal world, those will align, and a green lease is a way that can help you move that in the right direction. So what's the solution? I think it's kind of obvious. This is why we're chatting here today, leveraging leases. A key timing opportunity is obviously when a lease is being negotiated. So when you're starting a new lease, but also during a renewal. So oftentimes lease renewals can come up depending on your process. It could just be a simple sign off, business as usual, but that's a key opportunity to look at your original lease agreement and insert these green lease or net zero lease clauses. So taking a look at your lease renewal schedule and where are those opportunities to make some changes is really important. Green leases, also known as energy aligned leases or net zero leases, really can improve the rental negotiation process as well by creating these win-win agreements for building owners and tenants. Again, you can just improve upon the original lease or have a newer or better lease to present to a client or a tenant. These green leases or net zero leases can allow owners to overcome the split incentive, align costs and benefits of energy and water efficiency investments. It also sets expectations right at the front. So it sets those expectations for data collection, who's responsible for it, what format that data should be in to make it easier for those that are collecting it or analyzing it, and then also setting expectations for building operations as well. Green leases can also provide guidance on fit out opportunities. So helping them understand what the opportunities are for fit outs and to manage their own space in an energy and cost efficient manner. So what improvements to make within that space and what's going to benefit the overall building energy use. So the benefits of green leasing and net zero leasing for owners and tenants, we've talked a little bit about, but here's just a great picture to summarize that up. It can lower your operating expenses. It can increase the occupancy and base rents in your building. It adds to employee attraction and retention. It can also assist meeting your corporate sustainability goals, both building owner and tenant or occupier building and sustainability goals. We've often see this improves employee comfort, health, and productivity, not only because of the added energy efficiency bonus, but also because it improves communication and tenants and occupiers can really get what they want out of the lease arrangement as well. And then, of course, the fan favorite, complying with current and future regulations. This is, as Marla said, there's a lot coming down the line. So being ready and prepared is really important in today's market. Right now, we're going to talk a little bit about really the basics and the tools and the green leasing in the real world. How do I do this? How do I insert clauses? What are those clauses? How have other folks done this previously? What has been successful? What continues to be challenging? So Marla, I think you're going to start off a little bit with, or Paulina, I think you're hopping in next with some real world examples, and then I'll take it back in a little bit.
Yep, thanks, Kara. Before getting into case studies, we wanted to show you a bit of the research that speaks specifically to green leases. In one of our earlier surveys, we asked about the adoption of green leases, and on the next slide, we can see from this survey, we found that by 2025, adoption of green leases is set to double, increasing from 42% among investors and 34% among occupiers to 79% and 74% respectively by 2025. So investors and occupiers have both common and distinct reasons to pursue green leases. Adding to what Kara pointed out, for occupiers, if they're not engaging with their landlords on sustainability in their lease negotiations, they're essentially losing their greatest window of influence over the environmental performance of their building. For investors, if they don't have an occupier engagement strategy, they can't really have a full or effective decarbonization strategy. So leases are then a key tool to ensure effective tenant engagement, as well as landlord engagement from the occupier side. Shifting to a more recent study on the next slide, which where we surveyed over 800 respondents. This is a study from 2023. We surveyed corporate decision makers across 12 global markets. We found that today, what's currently being most included in these occupier leases are boilerplate clauses around energy, water, and waste, as well as building amenities, which aren't necessarily clauses that move the needle in terms of improving the performance of a building, but the focus is shifting. Our research shows that corporate occupiers are already looking to move on from these boilerplate clauses and prioritize more carbon-specific language, especially. And this is for their next lease, right? On the right, we can see that the clauses they're looking to include in future leases are concerning embodied carbon, electrification, EV charging stations, and so on. So these commitments are really showing how occupiers are looking to materialize on their commitments. These priorities will require that landlords and tenants make complex choices together regarding the real estate they share, the real estate they own or occupy. But overall, green lease ambitions will vary depending on occupier and investor profiles. They're not a plug and play model. Market conditions and building specifications will also kind of dictate what you can or can't include, or what you look to include in your leases. To give you a few real world examples, we'll first go to my colleague Joe Galambos, Workplace Sustainability Lead for the Americas. He'll be shedding some light on what we're doing here at JLL. Over to you, Joe.
Did we lose Joe?
Joe, if he's here, I think he.
Oh, sorry about that. Thanks,
Go.
Paulina. Yep. Yeah, so great. Thanks for introducing me. I'd like to talk a little bit about our own JLL global corporate office portfolio and some of the sustainability initiatives that we have globally, as well as what we're doing with our own corporate leases to address these. So we are a global portfolio of nearly 400 corporate offices in 52 different countries with a little over 4.5 million square feet of all leased space. JLL has pretty ambitious sustainability commitments, ranging from our commitments to be net zero emissions across all of these corporate workplaces by 2030, to some lighter touch commitments like eliminating single-use plastics from all our offices, or making sure we build out our spaces sustainably with a LEED or wellness certification for those that are over 10,000 square feet. We have a challenge both with our portfolio being all leased and the size of our leased space for the typical office, in that we're a smaller occupier in larger CBD Class A buildings, which gives us a little less leverage than if we were occupying a full building So what we've done to address this is we've integrated sustainability experts like myself into each stage of the real estate asset life cycle, starting with the lease negotiations and then continuing on through the project, design and the fit out and construction of our office to bring sustainability into the workplace experience for our employees and clients that visit our spaces. If you go to the next slide, show a little bit more about what that means and discuss how we do this in practice. So as I mentioned, JLL is a smaller occupier with a little more limited leverage. So to achieve our net zero commitments and meet these wider sustainability goals, we've developed an innovative approach, fully integrating our sustainability experts with our global team of corporate real estate experts so that we could decarbonize our portfolio at scale and speed. So our approach starts with due diligence of the short list of potential sites that we're looking at and any against our sustainability criteria to meet those sustainability commitments that we have. We follow that by making sure sustainability experts are part of the lease negotiations. And we work so we have colleagues like myself working alongside our transaction management and brokerage teams to ensure the lease language is drafted to align with those sustainability commitments. So we're part of the lease negotiation process, evaluating potential and existing office spaces against the cost, impact, and viability to collaboratively meet these sustainability criteria and our goals. So what we do is make sure that we are identifying any features and amenities that exist within the buildings that may align to our sustainability targets, and or things that are part of the building or our tenant space that may not align with our sustainability targets, and have customized lease clauses to address each specific instance. And these complement our standard set of green lease clauses, but are custom tailored for each asset and each office, because every negotiation ends up being a little bit different, especially with what's in the building and what's not. But we've had a lot of success with this, integrating with these transaction teams to make sure that simple things become part of our lease, so that when we get into the design and construction, really makes it possible to build out our spaces more sustainably and make sure that the lease language sets us up to do that, so that when we get into the project, we're able to design and construct our space sustainably so that that sustainability becomes part of the workplace experience. But I'd just like to mention that we're most successful with this when we can meet and collaborate with the landlord's sustainability experts to really align on shared goals and make sure that we have a lease that is helping both of us. And with that said, I'll turn it back over to Marla for some other examples to share.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. I love that, and I really appreciate that. And I think it is really important, that whole idea of actually bringing any sustainability teams. And I know not everybody has a sustainability dedicated person, but if there is, to actually have that person start to be involved in lease negotiations. We didn't, back when I was a director of sustainability, we would have never done that, right? And now people are really doing that more and more, which is great. So maybe if you have the ability to do that in your organization, that's something you can think about. And I mean, JLL just sort of showed like all the many benefits on why it's so critical. There's a couple of other examples too, again, as Kara says, of people doing this out in the wild. We have 2 new case studies that have been recently published on our Green Lease Leaders resources page. So highly recommend you go and take a look at these. They're really great. The first one is just stories from some green lease leaders, and just some very quick highlights. Ulta Beauty. major retailer that we all know. They've had really great success, really focusing on that fit out, trying to make sure they get submetering. And one thing that I really want to mention that I just thought was key is, like, for the longest time, they always just automatically said no pass-throughs from the landlord. Like, that was just kind of their stance, because they thought that it would impact them negatively. And then they changed their minds. Like, they saw that, no, wait a minute, we could save operating expenses if we, work with our landlords, if they have an efficiency measure to pass through. And so by that mind shift, they've been able to actually save a lot of operating expenses in their spaces. So I just think that's really a key. A company just may need to think about something just a little bit differently. And again, that speaks to that win-win scenario that we're looking for. Pure Industrial, they were a first-time green lease leader last year. And I just thought they had a really great perspective, because they had to do a lot of internal stakeholder engagement. They really, it was key for them, and they got a team together internally. They picked the clauses that they could all believe in, that they knew would help meet their goals. They trained their leasing team, and they've been really successful because of it. Everybody bought in, and particularly on the data. So they're an industrial and triple net lease situation. So it's really helped them be a lot more successful in collecting the data from their triple net tenants, just as one example. We also have a second case study that's it's called How Green Leasing Supports BPS Compliance. So we go back to that map that I showed earlier, and how complicated, those areas can be. So both of these companies are based in New York, and I just think, again, it's a great story here from both of them. I think one of the biggest takeaways here is not only is it just key to have a green lease in a BPS jurisdiction, it's a selling point. Because, for instance, Empire State Realty says so many of their tenants have their own sustainability standards. So they're coming to them because they know that Empire State also has that, and it's a selling point. So I don't know. I think that's a win-win, again, particularly in an office market, in a BPS jurisdiction. If a landlord can be all over it, if a tenant is willing to get in there, there's just again, win-win outcomes that can happen on the other side. ULI also has some great examples. Kara, what can you tell us about some of what you're seeing in the wild?
Sure. No, thanks, Marla. And I like that you have Jamestown as an example as well. And that's the first project I wanted to talk about. And I'll discuss a little bit about some of the challenges Jamestown had, and also some success they found as well. So Jamestown LP, this is their Ponce City Market property in Atlanta, Georgia. This is over 1 million square feet of mixed use space. It's a redeveloped historic building, which is important to note. And the motivation behind why they were considering green leases is because they needed whole building data emissions for their company-wide sustainability targets and data collection. So it also is interesting to note, for this particular building, most of the leases were inherited. So that makes it a little bit tricky, but it also gave an opportunity to say, we are inheriting this lease. These are the clauses that we would like to include at the next go around, or if it is a new lease, these are the clauses we are including when you renew your lease. And really, they used it as an opportunity to put in those clauses, or at least talk about what clauses they wanted to put in for data sharing and ideas and what they wanted to do with the data. So they really use that as an opportunity to start to educate and communicate with their tenants. Jamestown looked into submetering for the specific tenants, but they actually found their quotes were a little bit too high to justify the cost. So what they ended up doing was having a single person accountable for the entire portfolio when it came to data collection for that Ponce City Market property. They had a detailed spreadsheet for each building and commodity that looked at where the data came from and collected that on a very one-off basis. They are looking to make that easier over time with increases in data sharing from tenants. but they really saw that as they start to put green leases into place, communication became better, tenants were happier, and it really added to them being proactive in tenant communication alignment and with the eventual goal of whole building data collection. They use these lease agreements too, as you see in the slide, to set specifics for their buildings. So they set their power and lighting density loads to be 10% more efficient than code. And they have the ability to monitor usage via submetered electrical panels, but they found that they could not do that for the entire building just due to cost. Next slide. We'll talk a little bit about the tower companies. So the tower companies created a green lease and worked with their leasing staff and brokers to educate them again about the terms and conditions that were included. One challenge, as you would not be surprised to hear, was that there was a perception that the cost of the tenant space build out would be significantly higher, and each requirement in the lease was reviewed with the leasing and broker team to explain and walk through how the energy related requirements were at a low or no cost item. And some results of these green leasing clauses included was that they reduced the connected lighting power density by 16% below standards, and they're to install water fixtures that are 30% more efficient than the calculated baseline for the building. I think, Marla, we're going to jump back into where to start. We went through some examples. We talked about the why, we talked about the data points, but how do you do this for your own company, for your own building, or for your own current or to be developed lease? So Marla's going to start us off, and then we'll all jump around and give some insight on what we've seen work in the past and what's working now.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we do that, I believe we have a hand raised. Did somebody want to interject here? Tara, if we can make that happen real quick.
I've allowed you to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes. Okay. Oh, yes, I see it now. I see Tiffany. Tiffany, are you able to unmute to ask your question? If not, we can drop it in the chat. All right, well, let's keep going. And Tiffany, we do want to make sure and get to your question. So we'll either figure it out when we get to Q&A, or like I said, drop it into the chat, because we do want to make sure we get to as many questions as we can. All right, let's talk about where do you start? I mean, look at your strategy. Now, listen, I know, again, this is real world talk. Not every single landlord is going to play ball. Not every single tenant is going to play ball. But what you can't do is let perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, you got to do something, and you have to start. And the more you sort of go down the journey, the more traction you'll get, the more people that are asking. So again, even if you ask for something, no matter which side of the equation you're on, if you're asking, and even if the other party says no, 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 you planted seeds, and it may not work for that landlord, but guess what? It'll work for the next one. So you won't get it 100% right out of the gate, but just recommend that you have your standard. So start with your standard lease form. Whether, again, maybe if you're a tenant and you have, again, certain memo or things that you want to make sure, or if you are a landlord, you have it, whatever your standard lease form is, that you have your standard lease requirements, and you just filter in those things that are important. Data collection. Again, we're going to talk about specific clauses here in just a second. And as Kara mentioned earlier, this is applicable to both new leases and renewals. And then, yeah, so again, let's talk about what clauses you should start with. These are some recommendations. And I mean, just like when we were talking about pure industrial, they really sat and looked at, okay, what is important for us to meet our goals? Are you in a BPS jurisdiction? It's a little bit different. So again, look at where you are and start with wins. It's okay not to have like every single possible clause in from minute one, But take in everything that is going to make sense for your organization. So let's just talk about a couple of these. When you're just going into a new building on the tenant side, make sure you're fitting out your space to be as efficient as possible at that time. So really highly recommend you have a set of efficiency standards. Joe talked about that on the JLL side. I mean, you really want to make sure, again, this is the time when money is being spent. And so this is when you want to make your space the best it can possibly be for energy efficiency, for submetering, if it's at all feasible. You want to try to get submetering, again, depending on the lease type in that situation. But incorporating efficiency then is the most economical. You can utilize a TI allowance from the landlord and maybe even negotiate upgrades, right? Now, the sustainability contact for both parties. I'm really passionate about this one because it's really simple, but it helps facilitate discussions. Now, again, not every tenant, not every landlord has a sustainability person. And some people, it might be more of an operations person, but who would be the people that need to have a conversation should something come up related to energy, water, utilities? Because what I've heard it so many times from landlords who've said, we've got these major tenants who I know they have ESG goals, but we can't get them to do anything. Well, you know what? Sometimes the boots on the ground people, like, there's these commitments up here, but they don't know. And they're just trying to do their day-to-day job. And they're like, no, leave me alone. But sometimes if you can, at a higher level, have that conversation, you know who to reach out to, it can help, get things going at the other level. So just really think that, having that sustainability contact is a simple, easy one that can really help things down the road. All right, data transparency. This is a big one. As we discussed, throughout, utility data, as we know, is key. So if you control the data as a tenant, be willing to share that data with the landlord if they ask, or on a periodic basis, or if the landlord controls the data. Landlord, you should be willing to share the, if you've got whole building data, how can you share? If the tenant needs their own data, let them have the ability to submeter. I know it can be complex. I know that it can cost money, but negotiate so you can figure out how to make it work to where they can submeter, because guess what? They're also going to be more motivated to reduce their usage if they can see what their own usage is. Or, if that isn't feasible, make sure the landlord is providing you with some consumption data on a regular basis. I mean, I think this, and the more and more, if we see SEC rulings, now again, who knows what will happen there, and if scope 3 will be in there, but this whole data thing is just going to get messier and messier. So being able to put something in to where you need to get the data, but if you control it, you're also willing to share the data. Really important. And then a bonus tip, if you're in a BPS jurisdiction, I mean, there could be steep fines if the usage is not meeting the certain levels. So you and your landlord really need to discuss who's going to be responsible for what, including in associated fines, work together to find the best possible outcome. Because, again, if you don't have a discussion in a BPS jurisdiction, it could not, you don't want to be surprised by having nobody told you that you needed to control your usage, and now you've got a big fine to pay if you're a tenant. So nobody wants that. And just one last tip is just to be open to discussing or accepting recovery clauses from the landlord on capital expenditures. Or if you're a landlord, be willing to fairly put through efficiency measures, right? And again, talk to the tenant, you can amortize it for, a couple of years, and maybe even amortize it 80%. So they can see a little bit of the savings from day one. And then as soon as it's paid off, see all of the savings. Again, it's a win-win. You just have to have a discussion. Kara, I think you guys are, similar on kind of the, your recommendations for Glean. That's the combination, glean of green lease. So what initial recommendations do you have for the
I
clauses?
mean, Marla, they're so very similar to yours, so I'm not going to repeat everything you said. I am going to go through a few of these because I have some examples, but I also was reviewing the chat as well. And Edmay, you had a great question here. Hey, Edmay. In that, do you recommend putting specific lighting, power density, and other sustainability specifics in the lease language or reference tenant TI guidelines in the addendum to the lease? So that is a great question. And my answer is whatever you can get in there, get in there. So Marla had mentioned, you know, if you can get it in the lease, that's great because that's a signed contract, a legal agreement. So the tenant is being held to that contract. Tenant guidelines as an addendum are great as guidelines, but they're not a contract. But if that's your only opportunity to educate your tenants because you aren't at a lease renewal or there isn't room to renegotiate a new lease, then put it in there as a starting point. Hey, these are our guidelines. This is what we would like to include in the next, you know, lease renewal, or this is what we are including in all of our new leases. So at least that education piece gets started. So let's go back to types of green lease clauses and addenda to consider. Marla and Paulina and I have talked about data time and time again. So permission to access either, you know, tenant utility usage data, permission for submeters, or permission just to collect that data. And I believe we had another question directed right to data from Jan Klepp, where it says, what if the property manager should collect data, but it is not in their contract to collect and share it? So this is part of the struggle. This is why we want to have data collection and responsible parties listed out in the green lease, so we don't have issues like that, because you can ask for data collection and say we need this to be, especially where there are building performance standards, but certainly if it's not required and it's not in lease, that makes it that much difficult, and really that data sharing would be reliant upon the relationship you have with your tenant. So again, that's why education up front is so important. So even before it's inserted into your lease, you have set the stage for what you want to collect or what you want to offer. So operations, we talked about that a little bit. So setting operational parameters under which tenants should use their space or must use their space. I have an example from the American Geophysical Union headquarters here in DC. It's located in a net zero building that includes a tenant clause that limits the capacity of electric service to the building on a watt per square foot. So that's an example of including that in sort of the real world or out in the wild. Including cost share clauses is also important. So the ability to pass through the cost of energy and water efficiency upgrades to tenants on a prorated basis over the term of their lease. An example of that is Morgan Creek Ventures. Morgan Creek Ventures and its tenant, the Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI, they agreed on lease language that established energy use limits for the building and clarifies within the lease which party is responsible for overages on those limits. So that language is included within the lease. As Marla mentioned, having your sustainability championship and partnership outlined. So a requirement or suggestion to identify that champion and participation in activities, and really require that communication, whether it's a meeting or an email, or just sets the stage for how communication should be set for the length of the lease. The example I have that for partnership example is in Derwent, London. Derwent incorporated on and offsite renewable energy into their net zero leasing documents for an office building. They priced the solar energy at or below the market rate for its tenants, which is a valuable benefit, given the, obviously the often unpredictable prices of electricity and natural gas in London, but they really set that partnership up out in the leasing clause. And then finally, fit outs, as Marla mentioned, where there's a turnover of space and money is being spent to improve the space, to really set those minimum energy performance standards for major tenant purchased appliances, lighting, and other equipment. ULI does have an upcoming fit out primer for tenant spaces that'll be published in the next few months. So keep an eye out for that on LinkedIn and ULI's Knowledge Finder, where we publish our reports. And then Marla, I'm going to pass it back to you to talk a little bit more about green lease leaders and hopefully give us a few minutes for some Q&A from the participants here.
Yeah, super quick. Go to the Green Lease Leaders website. It doesn't matter if you're new in the journey, like every resource you need, sample lease clauses, it's all here. The resources are there. If you've already started your journey of green leasing, maybe you could apply to be a green lease leader. It's a big program that we run with the Department of Energy. And as of last year, we have over 6 billion square feet covered. So the portal is open now. Would love for you to apply. And there's also some green leasing resources across the globe. So for some of you that that also have other areas, that there's more than just us. But please go to Green Lease Leaders and we'll get you taken care of. So I'm just cognizant of time. Very interesting question in the Q&A. Are there any buildings considered grandfathered so the BPS are not applicable? And if so, do you have suggestions on how to identify those circumstances? Grandfathered, no, per se. There may be exemptions, right? So you always want to see if in a BPS scenario, look to see if they have any exemptions. Because again, there might be something there. Outside of that, I don't know of any other sort of grandfathered situations that there would be, but good question.
And just to add on that, Marla, too, I mean, admittedly, finding out what buildings have exemptions can be tricky. Different jurisdictions or different building performance standards have different exceptions, and you might have to dig a little bit to find that, but they are there. So there's certainly some resources. I know that ULI provides a resource on different jurisdictions and the requirements and some of the exemptions, but it's something to dig into a little bit to make sure that if you do have a building that exempt, you are recognizing that and making sure that it's recorded as that as well.
Yeah, and on the IMT website as well, imt.org/policy, you'll be able to dive into all 3 areas of policy, including the BPS. We have spreadsheets there that you can download, and it will take you again, link you to the site. So highly recommend anybody with questions about that and any kind of exemptions, I would go there. I mean, and this is an interesting sort of, piece of the conversation about this, because again, BPS is a thing, right? And it's coming down the pike. And it just means that, exemption, no exemption, the building performance matters. And it does need to be, again, sort of taken into account whenever you're leasing space. Again, be it tenant or landlord, it's part of, it's a new world, right? Just a little foreshadowing, there's a whole other green leasing 2.0, or sort of, we call it performance-based leasing. And we're going to do one of our upcoming webinars that will be in Q2. We'll address that a little bit. It'll be a little bit more of that sort of the next phase of green leasing. That's really important when it comes to BPS scenarios. How are we doing? We are at time. Oh my gosh, y'all, that went so fast. So yes, we've got 2 more webinars coming up. Watch your email. We will be sending you the recording and the slides. I know y'all want all of those JLL data slides because they're very powerful. So we will be sending that out to everyone, and keep an eye out because we've got Green Leasing 101 for the business teams, which is like leasing, brokers, legal, super important, right? So that will be in Q1. And in Q2 will be this sort of 201, like this next, especially related to in BPS jurisdictions and net zero goals, a little bit more to dig into there. So yes, there are references at the end, lots of great references that we'll send that will be here in the slide deck. Thank you, Paulina. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Joe. And thanks to Tara on the IMT team for helping us. Appreciate everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.